Pain, the rise and fall of the largest pill mill in the nation. Written by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Keith Madison Miller. DEA, growled the tall, lean black woman as she approached the crowd of patients meandering outside the pain clinic's entrance. A mixture of nearly a dozen federal agents, state health department investigators, county sheriff's deputies, and detectives marched in unison behind her. It was 8 a.m., mid-November 2008, in South Florida. The agent held up her Drug Enforcement Administration credentials high enough for all to inspect, but she gave no indication of breaking her stride. None of them did. The group of bewildered patients parted, allowing the law enforcement officers to enter the clinic. The agent found Derik Nolan standing at an administration desk with a cup of Java. Thick, black tribal tattoos encircled his left bicep and forearm. At 6 foot tall and 210 pounds of solid steroid-enhanced muscle, he was an intimidating figure. Comfortable in his indifference, Derik's perpetual smirk lets everyone know he thinks life's a joke. Not again, he thought, as the female agent stomped into the office. She thrust her DEA identification at several of the medical staff, and another agent started barking orders. The clinic had been operating on the fringe of legality since its inception. Derik wondered if this would be the day they would force the clinic to close. Derik Nolan did not own American Pain, what U.S. prosecutors would ultimately dub the single largest organized chain of pill mills in history, distributing in excess of 21 million oxycodone within a 2-year period while raking in over $40 million in cash. However, Derik had built, organized, and helped run the clinic from day one, an operation which Chris George, the owner, acknowledged skirted the edge of the law but did not break it. Derik, however, had his doubts. Over the next 6 hours, the DEA agents and assorted law enforcement reviewed patient files and inventoried the pharmacy's drugs. They even threatened some of the doctors and seized several thousand oxycodone, but didn't arrest anyone or shut the clinic down. At 2 p.m., Derik stepped outside the office where over 30 patients were milling around the entrance, hoping the clinic would reopen. With the agents, deputies, and investigators packing documents and medication into their vehicles, Derik unabashedly yelled to the crowd, "Thanks for waiting, everybody. We're open for business. Come on in." The tall, lean black agent squeezed her eyelids into a leering glare. Derik gave her a wink and grinned. Derik Nolan's mugshot rested just beneath Chris George's on the organizational chart mounted on the wall of the Multi-Organization Task Force office in West Palm Beach, Florida. The group itself was made up of DEA, ATF, FBI, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FIDL, and multiple sheriff's offices. It had been specifically organized to bring down American Pain. Underneath Derik's photo was scribbled, "Enforcer." To this day, while sitting in a federal prison in Central Florida, Derik still doesn't get it. He keeps telling me he's a nice guy. He's not a thug. He's not what the government called American Pain's muscle. Do you see that? Asked Derik in late 2016 during one of our preliminary conversations regarding my writing of his story. My eyes drift over the ink covering his arm and his broad, ridged, tension-filled shoulders, his sharp, square jawline, and the scars on his knuckles. "Nah," I reply insincerely. "I don't see that at all." Derik looks like the kind of guy you'd like to have a couple of beers with. However, you wouldn't want to leave him alone with your wife or girlfriend. Not because you couldn't trust Derik, but because you couldn't trust her around him. He's Tyler Durden, the anti-hero from Fight Club, a guy's guy. "I'm not some kind of meathead, bro." "Right, you're just like everybody else," I chuckle, mocking him just a little. "An average guy." Derik sighs, his eyes glaze over and drift off. And I know, I've got him all wrong. Derik Nolan's mother, Margaret, was lying naked on the couch in a post-coital embrace with Bob Kelly, the man she'd been seeing. It was after midnight, September 12, 1981, and despite the darkness, Derik's father, Robert, could see them clearly through the front window. The couple had been separated for several months. Both had been seeing other people, but they'd agreed to reconcile. His mother had said she was coming home. She'd promised. Yet she was lying naked in another man's arms, in another man's home. Derik's father entered the house through the screen door at the side of the house with his sleepy 4-year-old son shuffling in behind him, a little duckling in Superman underoos trying to rub the sleep out of his eyes. Although some of the details are cloudy, Derik distinctly recalls his mother gasping, "Oh, shit," at the sight of her husband standing in the living room and his father barking, "Oh shit, right!" Bob jolted awake, and all hell broke loose. The two men fought. Robert, however, was a big man, a strong man, and Bob took a beating as Derik's mother screamed. He was insane with anger and enraged. Suddenly, Derik's father grabbed a knife out of a butcher block in the kitchen, and Bob ran out of the house. Robert caught him in the driveway. He plunged the knife into his wife's lover, stabbing him 58 times, according to Derik, while his son cried and Derik's mother begged, "Don't kill him. Kill me. Kill me. It's my fault." "Don't worry, bitch," yelled Robert, hunched over Bob's motionless body. "You're next." Derik's father murdered his mother in the kitchen of Bob's house as his little boy watched. Decades later, Derik still remembers the linoleum floor, slick with blood, and his mother's lifeless stare, standing in the passenger seat of his father's truck as they drove away, the light in the window of the house fading into the distance. Hours later, Robert Nolan turned himself in at the local police station. "I remember wanting my mom," recalls Derik. "I was only 4, but I knew she was gone." Derik talks about the murder with an odd detachment. While discussing the subject, he has to pause several times to take deep, cleansing breaths. He asks me how much longer do we have to talk about her. He doesn't like to discuss the murder. He doesn't want to think about her. He's not the type of man who's comfortable with his emotions. "I didn't hate him for what he did," confesses Derik. "He was my father. He just lost control and made a terrible mistake. But it doesn't justify what he did." During his father's trial, Derik lived with his uncle Eric, his wife and cousins Todd and Kim. After his father was found innocent by reason of temporary insanity, Derik remained with his uncle. It was a more stable, safe environment. His father married Kimberly Lewis shortly after the trial. Over the next several years, the couple had 3 boys and eventually moved to New Jersey. To hear Derik tell it, his teen years were unremarkable. However, he was the Jeffersonville-Youngsville Central High School Trojans quarterback, but they never won sectionals, regionals, or state. There were homecomings, proms, and parties. Derik had lots of friends and girlfriends. He was an average teenage jock, according to Derik, clean-cut, polite, the kind of kid parents wanted their daughters to date. He graduated in 1995 and moved to South Florida to attend West Palm Beach State College. "By the time I was 20, I was working for a plumbing company making $75,000 a year," says Derik. He was managing millions in inventory and a dozen employees. Derik owned his own home and was driving a new Mustang. "I had a 20-foot well-crafted Eclipse, season tickets to the Dolphins, everything a 20-year-old could want. A really cool girlfriend and a gorgeous English bulldog I was totally in love with." I correct Derik, stating, "You mean you were in love with your gorgeous girlfriend?" "No," he snickers. "I meant the dog." Derik's father came down to see his son in early January 1998. His second marriage was deteriorating. Kimberly had threatened to take the boys and move out of their house. Despite his domestic problems, Derik's father seemed to be in good spirits. He wanted to spend a few days with his oldest son, to make things right, he told Derik. They had dinner a couple of times. He and his father spent a day fishing, but he never did clarify as to what the visit was about. Derik recalls just before he flew back to New Jersey, his father gave him a big bear hug and told Derik he loved him. Everything seemed fine. Later that day, January 8th, after Robert got home from the airport, his wife Kimberly handed him divorce papers. Derik's father stepped into his study, snatched his shotgun out of the cabinet, a 20-gauge camper special that Derik had bought him for Christmas. He entered the master bedroom and shot his second wife in the back as she turned to run. Kimberly crawled into the walk-in closet. Robert reloaded the weapon and shot her a second time, this time in the head. A neighbor heard the shots and called 911. Derik's father then walked out to the cabana near the pool, made himself a drink, and sat in a lounge chair at the edge of the water. He drank his scotch and smoked several cigarettes as he waited for law enforcement to arrive. Shortly thereafter, the SWAT team surrounded the house. Obscured from their view, Robert watched the SWAT members slowly tighten the perimeter around his house. He then placed a .25 caliber Beretta pistol to his head and squeezed the trigger. The round entered the right side of his temple, tore through his cerebellum, and exited the left side of his forehead. But it didn't kill him. Derik's father had to fire the semi-automatic a second time to finish the job. Their bodies weren't even cold before the reporters started calling, Derik tells me. He flew to New Jersey and cleaned up the murder-suicide scene. "I had to tell my little brothers what had happened. They were 4, 6, and 7 years old. Hardest fucking thing I ever had to do. No one should have to hear that." For the better part of a decade, Derik worked on and off in the construction field while struggling. Not financially, but in the general progression of life. He did not finish college as he'd intended. He didn't marry and have children. Instead, Derik jumped from relationship to relationship, never building up enough trust to commit to more than living with someone. Although Derik may disagree, his choice of friends left something to be desired. Mostly he bounced around with frat boy pranksters, the type of guys that get into bar fights, adult males that play with firecrackers and slingshots. The instant he saw the Northport Police Department cruiser pull in behind his Jeep Grand Cherokee, Derik knew he was going to jail again. It was November 15th, 2007, and he wasn't supposed to be driving. Derik's license had been suspended over a year earlier for neglecting to pay a driving without wearing a seatbelt ticket. He'd been ticketed for driving on a suspended license in August 2006 by the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office. Then again on December 3rd, 2006, only that time he was arrested, spent the night in jail, and had his Jeep impounded. He bonded out the next morning and picked up his vehicle from the impound lot. The following day, Derik was on his way to the DMV to pay his tickets and get his license reinstated when he was pulled over for the third time by a St. Lucie County Sheriff's cruiser for driving on a suspended license and rearrested. The next morning, he bonded out again. The series of misdemeanor driving on a suspended license violations led to a 5-year suspension of his license and 1-year felony probation. So, on November 15, 2007, when the Northport police officer told him to please step out of the vehicle, Derik knew what time it was. He quickly bonded out, called his probation officer, and explained the arrest for driving on a suspended license. "Again?" she squawked. "Well, I'm going to have to violate you, issue a warrant." "No," he replied. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do, Derik." She told him the paperwork would take at least 2 weeks. "I'll let you know when you got to turn yourself in. Whatever you do, don't drive anymore." On Tuesday, November 22nd, 2007, a week after that call, a West Palm Beach County Sheriff's cruiser pulled in behind Derik's Jeep and hit the lights. This time, however, after Derik bonded out, the sheriff's office refused to release his vehicle. It had been used to commit a felony, driving on a suspended license, and therefore subject to seizure. "Maybe you shouldn't mention all the driving on a suspended stuff," suggests Derik. He tilts his head back slightly, doing his best high school bully imitation. "They make me sound a little irresponsible. I mean, I did have a guy that drove me around most of the time. Didn't show up a couple of times, and that's how the whole thing got out of hand." I told him I was putting it in. "It's funny." "It's not funny, bro. They sold my fucking Jeep at auction, and I ended up having to do 6 weeks in jail for the probation violation. It sucked." Oxycodone, the drug, has been around since the 1920s and has been reasonably prescribed for decades with no adverse effects to our national addiction to opioids. The problem started in 1996 when a struggling Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin, containing a 12-hour controlled-release oxycodone formula, and their marketing department kicked into high gear. 1 tablet, twice a day, provided smooth and sustained pain control, was their pitch. However, the drug wore off after only 8 hours. Purdue pumped tens of millions of dollars into advertising, expanded their sales force, and pitched their product by incorrectly listing OxyContin as a moderate potent opioid that could be prescribed with relative safety to patients with limited addiction or overdose potential. When the patients complained the drug wore off hours before their next scheduled treatment, doctors were instructed to increase the dosage. Larger milligrams meant more profits. Over the next decade, directly following Purdue's marketing campaign, 3 things happened in the United States. 1, Purdue's profits shot up from $400 million to over $3 billion annually. 2, oxycodone prescriptions across the board increased substantially. And 3, opioid addiction in the United States increased tenfold. It was pure corporate greed. Even when the DEA eventually indicted Purdue's top executives for mislabeling the drug, putting a stop to their campaign of addiction, the executives only got probation. By then, the damage was done. An epidemic had been created. Derik stepped out of the St. Lucie County Jail on January 22, 2008. A 29-year-old felon, now serving 2 years probation in West Palm Beach County and Sarasota County, with no job and nowhere to live, and he still didn't have a driver's license. He ended up moving into a shitty little 2-bedroom apartment in West Palm Beach with a guy he'd known from high school. Derik's buddy, Chris George, called a couple of weeks later. He'd met Chris and his twin brother Jeff years earlier while building new homes during the housing boom. They were a couple of rich beefcake pretty boys whose father owned majestic homes. Derik had done some subcontract work for him, and the trio became friends. They were all into steroids and strippers. The twins were even more reckless and immature than Derik. The fact is, Derik liked the Georges a lot, particularly Chris. They got along real well. Chris needed Derik to help him do a quickie build-out for the pain clinic he was opening. "You're not a doctor," laughed Derik. "What are you talking about? You don't have to be a doctor to own a clinic. Believe it or not, most hospitals and clinics are not owned by medical professionals. The only requirement was an occupational license and proper zoning." The doctors who work for pain clinics primarily help patients manage their pain by prescribing some form of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid. It's available as wreaking for breakthrough pain and in controlled release form known as oxycodone. Despite needing to be under a physician's care to obtain a prescription for the highly addictive narcotic, Roxy's and Oxys were becoming the street drug of choice in Central Florida and in a dozen other southern states. That doesn't sound right. Doesn't sound legal. It's legal. Chris already owned a couple youth rejuvenation clinics with a quack doctor named Michael Overstreet. Steroid clinic, so Derik thought. It might be possible, might be legal. The office building was located in Oakland Park, about 30 miles south of West Palm Beach, a low-budget commercial space in a lower middle-class area. There was no shortage of laundromats, pawn shops, or vagrants. It took less than a week to gut the interior and do a cheap renovation. No permits or inspections. The large red and white sign, South Florida Pain Clinic, required more paperwork than licensing the clinic itself. According to Derik, they were never able to get the permits for the sign. They just put it up. Within days of the paint drying, the clinic was open for business and seeing patients. Just over a week later, Derik was still trying to wrap his head around how Chris could open a pain clinic. He and his roommate were headed home from a construction job when his cell phone rang. Chris needs him to babysit the clinic the following day. Diana, Chris' ex-stripper girlfriend, the office manager, didn't feel comfortable with the clientele. Overstreet was typically in the examination room, and she was alone most of the day in the receptionist area with the patients. "Some of these guys are sketchy," said Chris. South Florida Pain was advertising in the back of The New Times, a local paper that advertised escorts and massage parlors. Plus, the clinic wasn't requiring MRIs. As a result, South Florida Pain was attracting patients exhibiting drug-seeking behavior. Opiate addicts, junkies. "I'll give you $400 for the day." "Dude, I don't know," sighed Derik. "The whole place felt illegal. You're going to get me locked up." Chris threw in a gym membership, and Derik agreed. It was just one day. That one day turned into 2 days a week. Then Diana asked Derik to come to work full-time. "I'll pay you whatever you want," she said. "I'll pick you up every morning and drop you off." That's how Derik Nolan got involved in the pain clinic business, as a favor for a friend. Dr. Overstreet didn't show up Monday morning after his week-long fishing trip to Panama. No one knew where he was or how to get hold of him. An Indian woman, Dr. Rachel Gittins, had filled in for Overstreet, but she'd returned to New York and there were no other doctors at the clinic. Patients were sitting in the waiting room rocking and perspiring or wandering around the parking lot, periodically throwing up in garbage cans due to withdrawals. Derik told Chris that Overstreet was a flake, he never liked them, he probably wasn't coming back. In a panic, Chris called Gittins and convinced her to fly back to Florida and take over for Overstreet. She hopped on the next plane to South Florida and was seeing patients that afternoon. Not long after, they learned that Overstreet had flipped his Jeep while on vacation. He ended up dying in a shallow ditch somewhere in Panama. He wasn't coming back. Chris placed an ad on Craigslist for a doctor. Days later, he received a call from Dr. Enoch Joseph, a 39-year-old gynecologist who was working at Pain Begone. He was making $35 a patient. Chris offered him $75, and Joseph started within the week. South Florida Pain now had 2 doctors cranking out scripts from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., seeing 10 to 12 patients per hour, each receiving roughly 240 oxycodone and 120 controlled-release oxycodone. However, Chris kept the Craigslist ad running. Within weeks, he'd hired Dr. Patrick Graham and Dr. Eddie Soley. Then there was Dr. Arcadis, Dr. Rolfe, Dr. Silk, etc. Most worked part-time. They'd come in for a couple of hours and leave with $1,000 or $2,000. Derik could only remember one doctor who refused to work for the clinic. The interview had gone fine, but when the doctor got home that night, he ran a background search on Chris and came across several arrests. The next morning, he called Chris and told him he couldn't work for him. The business model wasn't all that sophisticated. An initial consultation ran $200. Each subsequent visit cost $150. The patients then had the option to fill their scripts at the clinic or at a local pharmacy. South Florida Pain quickly became a mill, churning out opiates and raking in lots and lots of cash. "This can't be legal," Derik told Chris while cutting through a fillet at Rain Dancer Steakhouse. It was nearly 11 p.m. sometime in early May 2008. Every day they were seeing more and more patients. The clinic had been open over 2 months, and Derik couldn't believe some government organization hadn't shut them down yet. "Alcohol's legal and you don't need a script," mumbled Chris. "California's got medical marijuana." According to Chris, if the doctors felt the patients were in need of medication, they wrote them a prescription. No one was guaranteed medication. Neither Chris, Derik, or Diana were doctors. All they were doing was running the clinic. If any laws are being broken, it's by the doctors. "Sure," grunted Derik, unconvinced. "Sounds good." However, Derik knew Chris was specifically ordering generic versions of oxycodone and oxycontin from multiple wholesalers using each doctor's DEA registration number in an attempt not to raise any red flags. His concern being the ever-increasing amount of oxycodone being purchased would put South Florida Pain on someone's radar. The clinic was bringing in $50,000 a day, roughly $1 million a month, and Chris knew that was only a fraction of its potential. Derik figured he'd stick around until he got his driver's license back or the authorities chained the doors closed, whichever came first. But then he was gone. "Don't start talking about leaving again," said Chris. "Diana and the docs like having you here." Everyone felt safer when Derik was around. "You know what we're dealing with." Zombies is what Derik called them. Opioid-dependent patients with sluggish response time and endlessly sleepy, dazed, expressionless faces. There were some patients with a legitimate need for controlling pain, individuals with verifiable medical issues like cancer, bulging discs, etc. Derik always made sure those patients were seen first. There was no reason for them to be subjected to the zombies, so he always got them in and out of the clinic as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the bulk of South Florida Pain's clientele were straight junkies. They'd nod out while sitting in the waiting room or wander around the parking lot smoking cigarettes. Or worse, they'd sit in their vehicles, crush up pills, and snort them while sitting in front of the clinic. Like toddlers in a daycare, every 15 minutes or so, Derik had to go outside and herd the zombies back into the waiting room before the neighbors complained. It was hardly a business-like clinical environment. By the time Dr. Gittens mentioned that the clinic needed to start requiring diagnostic work like drug tests and MRIs, Chris and Derik were acutely aware that opioids were becoming a national problem. However, pain clinics, not the pharmaceutical companies nor the junkies, were being blamed. So they decided to tighten up on the clinic's prescription requirements. MRIs required a doctor's referral, so Derik had Gittens and several of the doctors sign blank prescriptions. He then turned around and charged the patients $50 for the referrals. Derik wrote 40 the first day. A week later, MRI salespeople began showing up. Reps from Plantation MRI, Fay Imaging, Delray Diagnostics, Commercial MRI, etc. College-educated medical industry professionals were suddenly kissing Chris and Derik's asses, requesting lunch appointments where they'd pitch their company services and offer them NASCAR, Dolphins, and Miami Heat tickets and gift certificates for anywhere they wanted. But the real incentive for Chris and Derik wasn't the kickbacks, it was the turnaround. The industry average is 72 hours. "Bro," Chris told one rep, "we're going to need them way faster than that." "Yeah, dude," interjected Derik. "The amount of patients we're going to be sending you, 3 days ain't going to cut it." It was the equivalent of Beavis and Butthead negotiating with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and with cash incentive. "Right, bro. Enough with the fucking gift cards." The clinic was referring so many patients, the MRI companies began competing with one another for the clinic's business. Within the first month, several of them dropped their turnaround time from 72 to 48 hours, then 24 hours. On Fridays, the reps would meet Derik in the parking lot to drop off thousands of dollars in cash kickbacks. The billboards read Pain Clinic, along with the clinic's phone and highway exit number. Chris lined Interstate 95 with them, and they worked. The clinic had been advertising in the New Times and a dozen different Yellow Pages ads. Additionally, they were using search engine optimization. You couldn't type pain clinic without being directed to the clinic site. But the billboards really brought in the business from South Florida and beyond. Before long, pillbillies from the hills of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, etc. descended on the clinic. Suddenly, the parking lot was overflowing with vehicles with out-of-state tags. That was a problem. Within weeks, there were too many vehicles for the parking lot and too many patients for the waiting room. They wore wife beaters and spat chew while standing in line outside the clinic, and eventually, the neighbors started complaining. Before long, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel ran the article, "Neighbors Calling Clinic a Pain." Patients were parking in their business's parking lot and using their restrooms, wreaking havoc, shoplifting, dining and dashing, pulling what Derik dubbed junkie stunts. Then the Oakland Park Police Department began harassing South Florida Pain's customers. They'd pull over patients as they left the clinic, search their vehicles, and question them regarding their prescriptions. Sometimes the cops would arrest them and tow their vehicles. Chris and Derik got the message. The cops were an issue, says Derik. By August 2008, the clinic had relocated to an office complex located 2 miles west of I-95. There was plenty of square footage and parking spaces. It was just a temporary space until the unit we wanted became available, Derik laughs. We threw it together like a triage center. They stapled panel board walls up and divided the space into small exam rooms along with a large waiting area. Within days, South Florida Pain began receiving complaints from the neighboring businesses. The zombies were urinating in their business bushes and behind their customers' cars. According to Derik, they were pulling junkie stunts. Several had been seen tossing trash in the parking lot and getting blowjobs in their vehicles. We hadn't been open 2 fucking weeks when this insurance guy comes in, recalls Derik. He tells me, "Your patients keep coming in my business," his Allstate agency, like they're going to buy an auto policy or homeowner's insurance. Then they ask to use the restroom. Most of the time, the patients would use the facilities and walk out without buying anything. However, multiple patients had passed out on the toilet after shooting up. He told Derik he was constantly finding needles in the trash or floating in the toilet bowl. Derik asked the agent what he expected him to do about it. The guy started yelling, and I had to toss him out of the fucking place, said Derik. I'm pretty sure that guy called Carmel Cafiero, the reporter with WSVN-TV, Channel 7 News. Cafiero specialized in tabloid sensational investigative journalism. On October 17th, she ambushed Derik and Chris outside South Florida Pain's triage center. Her cameraman sidestepped around them as the reporter thrust her microphone into their faces and asked about patients snorting pills and shooting up. She wanted to know why so many of their patients were from out of state. Chris and Derik ducked into the clinic, leaving the reporter outside. She spent the next few hours accosting patients and shouting questions at the doctors, but no one had a comment. Overall, Cafiero didn't get much out of the ambush. However, when the report ran later that week, it painted a sinister picture of South Florida Pain, along with Chris and Derik. Cash was coming in so quickly they began stuffing it into black, hefty garbage bags. Once each bag was full, Derik would take them in the back and Chris would pile the bills into cash counter machines. The bundles were then wrapped and stacked into cardboard iCup instant drug test kit boxes for transport to the bank. Chris Bank was initially apprehensive about accepting deposits of $50,000 to $100,000 in cash from a medical clinic dispensing narcotics. But when he began walking in with $200,000 to $300,000, their trepidation turned to fear, and the bank closed Chris' business account. What kind of bank won't take cash? Chris used to complain. They tried several other banks, but they continued to get the same story. It's suspicious, the bank managers would tell them. Legitimate businesses don't deal strictly in cash. One bank, after another, allowed them to open business accounts only to close them days later. Chris had boxes of cash stashed around his house, $200,000 here and $500,000 there. The cash was a real problem, especially for Jeff George's roommate, John Robert Eddy. He had what Derik describes as sticky fingers. A single bead of sweat slowly rolled down Robbie's forehead as the polygraph examiner methodically asked his questions. His monotone voice gave no indication of whether the machine was accepting Robbie's answers as deceptive or truthful. $300,000 had been stolen out of Chris's vehicle a month earlier, and 2 days prior, over $200,000 had gotten snatched during a burglary of Chris's house. Chris and his brother, Jeff George, had narrowed the suspects down to 3 of their friends: Chris Hudson, Gino Marquez, and John Robbie Eddy. Derik glared at Robbie from the doorway of Chris George's dining room. He had instructions not to let anyone leave until the tests were finished. Derik could see the perspiration seeping into his cotton tee, turning the material dark underneath Robbie's armpits. He'd never particularly liked Robbie or the other two. They were your basic scumbags, according to Derik, leeches, always looking for a handout. Once the last of them had been tested, Chris talked to the examiner. Then Chris stepped into the living room and announced all three of them had passed. The suspects feigned disgust at having been accused of such a thing. They were all friends, for God's sake. After they'd stomped out, Chris informed Derik Robbie had failed miserably. Days later, Jeff kept Robbie busy at lunch while Derik searched his vehicle. He found $20,000 in cash stuffed in a bag in a toolbox wrapped in the clinic's rubber bands. That really pissed Derik off. Admittedly, he went a little nuts at the thought of a supposed friend stealing from his friends. Derik and Chris waited in Jeff's massive house for Jeff and Robbie to return. They were concealed in a room adjacent to the master bedroom where Jeff and Robbie entered the room. Robbie barely had enough time to register Derik's presence before Derik hit him with a right hook. Smash! Robbie fell backwards, hit the wall, simultaneously lost control of his bowels and bladder. Derik scooped him up and slammed him onto the carpet. Boom! As Derik snapped the handcuffs on Robbie, he realized he'd shit smeared on his arm. The stench was unmistakable. He stepped into the restroom to wash himself off. Robbie regained consciousness, and according to FBI reports, Chris and Jeff started demanding the money. Suddenly, Jeff pulled out a semi-automatic and fired several shots into the floor next to Robbie's head. Derik ran out of the bathroom. The stench of feces and urine was overwhelming, and he damn near puked. Chris and Jeff were standing over Robbie. All they wanted was the money back, they told him, as Robbie screamed, "I don't have it!" Derik popped Robbie a few times while yelling at him to give up the money. He scared him pretty good, but Robbie didn't change his story. He confessed to the $20,000 Derik had found. However, he wouldn't admit to the theft of the $300,000 or the $200+ grand. Robbie began sobbing and pleading for them to let him go. Suddenly, Chris and Jeff weren't so sure he was the perpetrator. The George brothers decided to just let Robbie go. He didn't have the cash, or even if he did, he wasn't going to admit to it. No harm, no foul. The problem was Robbie wasn't the kind of guy to keep his mouth shut. "What are you two talking about?" asked Derik. "We're not letting him go." They had brought him to Jeff's house, handcuffed him, and tried to beat a confession out of him. That's kidnapping. You can get 20 to 30 years for kidnapping. "We gotta kill him." "No!" yelled Chris and Jeff. The Georges owned an expansive, swampy, wooded area roughly 20 miles from Jeff's house, where the three friends hunted occasionally. "We'll bury him in the swamp. No one will miss him. He's an asshole." Robbie pleaded with him to let him go. He swore he wouldn't say anything. Chris and Jeff believed him. They ended up having him sign some paperwork exonerating the three of them of the incident, and they gave him $10,000 in hush money. Derik still isn't sure if he'd have killed Robbie. He was just about as pissed off at Chris and Jeff. They were constantly getting him involved in their bullshit. Several months later, Robbie had a domestic violence incident involving his girlfriend. He was arrested for being a felon in possession of a firearm by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. According to the FBI 302 report of Robbie's interview, in an effort to get a reduced sentence, he immediately spilled his guts about the kidnapping and the pain clinics. He described the Georges pain clinics as a criminal enterprise and Derik as their cokehead thug enforcer. That's how Derik's name came to the attention of the FBI, and not long afterward, the DEA started paying attention too. Derik was standing at a desk in the back office sipping a coffee when a tall, lean black woman walked into the administrative area. It was mid-November 2008, slightly before 8 a.m. She held up a set of credentials that read DEA, and Derik's stomach wrenched. Another agent barked for the staff to produce their IDs. Over the next 6 hours, the DEA agents and assorted law enforcement reviewed patient files and inventoried the pharmacy's drugs. They even threatened some of the doctors, but they didn't arrest anyone. They seized several thousand oxycodone, but they didn't shut the clinic down. Once they left, Chris and Derik stepped into Chris's office. Derik tilted his head back and asked, "What do we do, bro? We got patients standing outside, and the docs are in the employees' lounge doing nothing." Chris glanced apprehensively at the stacks of patient files the DEA had gone through, and he let out a deep breath. I know the files are good, MRIs, UAL, urinalysis labs. They're all there, so we're good, he said, more to himself than to Derik. We're good. "All right, bro," grunted Derik, and he headed to the entrance. At 2 p.m., Derik stepped outside where over 30 patients were lingering around the parking lot, with the agents and the investigators packing seized documents and medication into their vehicles. Derik yelled to the crowd, "Thanks for waiting, everybody. We're open for business. Come on in." The tall, lean black agent squeezed her eyelids into a leering glare, and Derik gave her a wink and a grin. Within a week of the DEA leaving, the office complex's management company told Chris and Derik the clinic had to vacate the premises. Leave. Get out. There were zombies roaming the parking lot, and the complex's other tenants were complaining. There was a constant stream of inquiries by news organizations and law enforcement agencies. "We've got undercover police vans in the parking lot," whined the property manager. "The semi-raid probably didn't help. You guys have to go." Chris and Derik quickly moved the clinic to a large space in an industrial area near the airport. They weren't there a month before the zombies began wreaking havoc, and they were forced to leave. That particular eviction, according to Derik, was orchestrated by the local sheriff in collusion with the county zoning department. By the time the clinic relocated to Boca Raton in March 2009, they'd changed the clinic's name to American Pain to avoid bad press, and hired several new doctors, one being Dr. Cynthia Cadet, a thin black woman in her mid-30s with what Derik described as a hot body and bookish sex appeal. Over the course of several months, he began paying attention to Cadet. She was nice. Too nice to be working at the clinic, around all the junkies, thought Derik. He started to worry about her. Derik began walking Cadet to her car at night and picking up her lunch during the day so she didn't have to see the insanity in the waiting room, and he'd check on her when examinations ran too long. Derik liked Cadet a lot. They had an odd Beauty and the Beast friendship, the bookish female doctor and the tattooed thuggish head of security. In truth, Derik had a little crush on Cadet, but he never acted on it for several reasons. One, she was married, although she admitted it was an unhappy marriage. And two, Derik felt like she could do better than him, and he wanted better for her than him. Over the course of the next several months, Chris and Derik transformed American Pain into the largest pain clinic in the nation, treating over 250 clients per day with a base of over 20,000 patients. They were churning out over 30,000 oxycodone per day and raking in more cash than they could spend. Chris' twin brother Jeff was running 2 clinics in West Palm Beach, and Chris' girlfriend Diana managed the 3rd clinic across town. In addition to American Pain's in-house pharmacy, Chris had bought a freestanding pharmacy and within months, a 3rd pharmacy. There were local, state, and federal agencies actively trying to shut them down, and they were constantly being inspected or probed, but no one seemed to be able to figure out how to close their doors. The patients, opioid addicts from all over the country, were taking Interstate 95, what law enforcement dubbed the Oxy Express, to South Florida. They kept coming and coming. The volume was overwhelming. For the sake of efficiency, the entire operation was McDonaldized. Derik hired a bunch of silicone-breasted ex-strippers and steroided-out gym rats to work as security guards, receptionists, medical staff, and quality control personnel. An assembly line of staff filled out the clinic's medical forms, verified all referrals, medical records, and MRIs. From the outside, the clinic's staff had the air of legitimacy, but just underneath their casual business attire were belly button rings and tattoos. Cash was stuffed into garbage bags and counted by Chris or the office manager. For the first time, Derik believed he and Chris had stumbled into a legal loophole. They were drug dealers, but semi-legit drug dealers, and it didn't matter to them that the DEA had formed a task force and had a surveillance van parked in the clinic's lot. Sure, thought Derik, we're coloring outside the lines a little bit, but Chris's business model's bulletproof. Everything we were doing was legal, says Derik. He and Chris were working 60 to 70 hours a week. We couldn't even spend all the cash. They were driving Lamborghinis, BMWs, Land Rovers, and Mercedes, and I didn't even have a fucking license. Derik managed to get away from the clinic every once in a while. He did a week in Florence, Italy, for an ex-girlfriend's wedding. There were a dozen long weekend trips to Las Vegas and New York filled with strip clubs and gambling. He and Jeff partied with the bunnies at the Playboy Mansion in L.A. I'm not a flashy guy, says Derik. I had a bunch of designer stuff, Hugo Boss, Prada, Armani, but mostly I'm a blue jeans and t-shirt guy. American Pain was a circus. Derik was always trying to keep the zombies occupied. He made sure the clinic was visited regularly by food trucks, hot dog trucks, Italian icy trucks, ice cream trucks, you name it. He'd have pizza delivered. There were always movies playing on the flat screens in the waiting room, Regardless, he and the clinic's security guards still had to do sweeps of the parking lot, where they were forever catching patients pulling junkie stunts like throwing up, snorting pills, or having sex. Once, Dr. Cadet called Derik in the staff lounge. She and other doctors had noticed brown spots on several of their patients' faces. Possibly bruises or smudges of dirt. Have you noticed that? Asked Cadet. I haven't, but I'll look into it, Doc. The clinic was churning out over 24 patients an hour at this point, and Derik hardly paid them any attention. He stepped into the waiting room and began scanning his occupants. There were over 100 slack-jawed zombies aimlessly wandering about, or mindlessly slouching in chairs, staring into space, sipping sodas, and eating ice cream cones. Derik noticed one particular patient balancing a chocolate ice cream cone while struggling to keep his eyes open. Slowly, the zombie's eyelids grew heavier and heavier until they closed. His head slowly began to drop forward until his chin dipped into the chocolate scoop. Immediately, the patient jolted upright, but he didn't seem to notice the smudge of chocolate on his chin. Derik glanced around and noticed several other patients with spots on their noses, cheeks, and foreheads. This is insanity, he thought. Goddamn junkies. American Pain's addicts were more of a problem than ever by the summer of 2009. While sitting in the waiting room, patients would pop Xanax to calm their nerves and curb their withdrawals. At least once a week, some junkie would go into a dementia-induced hallucination and start swatting at non-existent butterflies or strip off their clothes and have an argument with some imaginary tormentor. Then they'd drop onto the floor, go into a seizure, and the staff would have to call an ambulance. Not a day went by that Derik or one of the staff didn't catch some patient lying on their paperwork. They were constantly catching doctor shoppers, patients acquiring oxycodone from multiple doctors or trying to pass off a forged MRI. Sometimes Derik would physically escort them to the door and eject them from the premises. Other times he would take pity on them and point them toward the interstate. By this point, Fay Imaging had purchased a mobile MRI machine, and they were spitting out MRIs within an hour. The truck was permanently parked in the parking lot behind Solid Gold, a strip club off Blue Heron Boulevard and I-95. Often, the addict would confide in him, "There's actually nothing wrong with me." Derik would suggest they tape a staple to their lower back. The metal will typically warp the MRI's resolution, thereby creating the illusion of an abnormality. "You sure that'll work?" "Yeah," he replied with a grin. "Of course, depending on the strength of the MRI's magnet, it might rip the staple through your spine, but I'm willing to bet your life it'll be fine." "Thanks, Derik," they'd say, and stumble off to the strip club. To keep the zombies from wreaking havoc, Derik typically gave them a speech twice a day. He would stomp into the waiting room, act frustrated, run his hand through his hair, and demand everyone's attention. "Here's the deal," he'd announced. "If you've got out-of-state tags on your vehicle, don't park in the clinic's lot. Don't drive under the influence of the meds. If you do and you get arrested, don't call here and ask me to bail you out. Don't give me a fake MRI. If you do, I'll take your consultation fee and kick you out, and I'm going to keep your money. And whatever you do, don't let me catch you selling pills." The speeches were legendary, constantly evolving, designed to keep everyone in line, but it didn't deter the hardcore junkies. Nothing could. The clinic's pharmacy tech was Derik's oasis in the sea of filth and insanity in which he dealt with daily. Jennifer was a petite, bottle-blonde hottie with a tight little ass, according to Derik, and a great smile. She was shiny and new, innocent, a single mother with a precocious little toddler daughter that Derik was in love with. Jennifer was everything Derik wanted for all of about 15 minutes. Shortly after they moved in together, her trailer park trash roots began to show. Jennifer quit working at the clinic, and suddenly she started making demands. Jennifer didn't even have a job, recalls Derik, but she wanted a maid to help clean the townhouse, a daycare to watch her daughter. Jennifer had been with the clinic during the surprise inspection, and she'd seen the van sitting in the parking lot. During one particularly nasty argument, she let Derik know it was in both his and Chris' best interest to keep her happy. "This chick was fucking extorting me," said Derik. "Jennifer would make these veiled threats, and I'd start mentally digging a hole in the swamp, but Chris kept telling me to do whatever she said. Just pay her, we're making millions," he'd say. So Derik bought Jennifer a new car and jewelry, whatever she wanted. Her daughter was adorable. She was one of those little kids that makes you want to get married and be, respectable. But the mother... Derik slid his pointer finger across his neck in a cutthroat motion. She was the worst. In Derik's opinion, Everyone that worked at the clinic knew it was a pill mill. Even the doctors knew. How could they not know? But none of them ever verbalized it. None dared utter those words aloud. Derik would joke with Dr. Cadet, saying, "You know, we're all drug dealers, right? This place is nothing but a dope hole." "No, Derik," she would reply with a disappointed smirk. "We're helping these patients. They're suffering, they're in pain, and they need treatment." Derik shrugged it off. The way he saw it, all the doctors were basing their participation in the clinic on plausible deniability. The only one who ever hinted at what the clinic was, however, was Dr. Patrick Graham. Periodically, Graham would refuse to write a patient a prescription, and Derik would have to give him a talking to, something Derik always found amusing. Graham worked part-time. He'd come in 2, sometimes 3 days a week for a couple of hours. It was easy money, but the guy was always bitching and moaning. He'd complain that the patients had track marks, or they would specifically refer to oxycodone by its street names, blues and greens. Graham didn't like that. "I know what's going on here," Graham once told Derik. "I know what this place is." "Yeah?" Derik replied, arching his brow while nodding his understanding, trying not to smile. Graham had been collecting $2 to $3 grand a week in cash for the past year. Of course he knew what the clinic was. "So, if you know what this place is, Doc, what are we talking about this for?" Derik pointed to the exam room. "Get back in there and start writing scripts." Graham acted appalled as he moped around, put on a show of reluctance, and Derik suggested the doctor would probably be happier working somewhere else. "All right, Derik," Graham snapped. "That's not necessary." He grabbed the next patient's chart and headed back to the exam room. They went through the same routine every week or two. Derik still doesn't know why. Neither he nor Chris ever once forced a doctor to write a prescription. Not once. Chris Brothers Clinic wasn't doing anywhere near the patient volume of Chris and Derik's American Pain. Instead, Jeff was focusing on selling in bulk to oxycodone dealers. He would dummy up the paperwork for several thousand pills and have Zach Boysette, a buddy fresh out of the Marines, delivering the oxys to dealers in the area. Chris mentioned his little side endeavor to Derik on a couple of occasions, but he wasn't interested. "Dude, there's no reason to do that," said Derik. "You're turning a legitimate money-making enterprise into something illegal. It's stupid." The issue occurred due to the multi-agency task force, which included the DEA and the FBI. They were constantly sending in undercover officers and CIs, confidential informants, posing as patients, in an effort to obtain information on the clinic's activities and evidence the doctors were prescribing narcotics outside the realm of legitimate medical practices. The CIs would admit to excessive drinking or indicate they had pain in a region in contradiction to their MRI's results, and the doctors would always refuse to write them a script. It's Derik's understanding that out of half a dozen CIs, none received a prescription, ever. Regardless, on November 6, 2009, the task force agents were somehow able to obtain permission to wiretap Chris' phone calls. The government would ultimately allege that patients overdosed and people died as a direct result of the doctors at American Pain prescribing oxycodone. In reality, the government overreached in an effort to paint everyone involved with the clinic as a monster. In fact, the government went to great lengths to connect those deaths with American Pain. For example, one patient death resulted from a documented heart condition. However, he had been a patient and did have oxycodone in his system. According to the government, this somehow meant he died because he was their patient. Another patient died in a car accident. He did have oxycodone in his system, but he had prescriptions from several other clinics, an obvious doctor shopper, and he'd not been to American Pain in several months. There's no way to know if the accident was a result of the oxycodone, nor was there any way of knowing which of the multiple pain clinics doctors had prescribed it. Then there was Tracy Mason, who overdosed behind the barn of his family's farm. Tracy hadn't received a prescription from American Pain in over 6 months. Still, he had oxycodone in his system, so the government insisted his death was a result of him being a patient. Ultimately, there was a car accident on November 19, 2009, that was the subject of one of Chris and Derik's conversations. Several patients of another clinic, patients that were obviously high on oxycodone, somehow managed to get themselves struck by a train. "You gotta be an idiot to get hit by a train," Chris said to Derik in a recorded call. "What idiots?" "Yeah," laughed Derik. "Who gets killed by a train?" Those conversations, along with the CIs, despite none of them ever receiving a prescription, helped to form the foundation of the government's case against Chris, Jeff, and Derik, among others, in what the government characterized as a continuing criminal enterprise run by racketeers. Dr. Cadet, was upset. Derik could tell she'd been going through a divorce, they had 2 kids, and her soon-to-be ex-husband was making it hard on her. Derik didn't like that. "Look," he said, glancing around in a conspiratorial way. He told Cadet he didn't like seeing her unhappy. All she had to do was give him the word. "I'll throw this guy in the trunk of my car and drop him in a hole. I got the perfect spot." Cadet giggled. "No, that's sweet, but it'll work itself out." Derik shrugged and grunted. "I'll dig a hole this weekend just in case you change your mind." Cadet laughed. In her defense, she genuinely believed he was playing. Competition began encroaching in what Chris and Derik considered their territory. Mostly they were small mom-and-pop pain clinics seeing less than 30 patients a day. They posed no significant threat to American Pain's super Walmart of oxycodone. As long as the smaller clinics minded their own business, Chris and Derik didn't have a problem with them. Unfortunately, in late November, within a span of a week, several patients approached Derik. All said they'd received calls from him regarding American Pain's newest clinic, Jacksonville Pain. Derik blew off the first few thinking they were junkie delusions. There was no plan for a Jacksonville location, and he damn sure hadn't called any of them. One patient, however, provided Derik with a return number. He gave it a try, asked to speak with Derik Nolan, and sure enough, the guy that answered replied, "This is Derik Nolan." He then proceeded to tell Derik how the new American Pain location would save the average out-of-state patient 12 hours round-trip drive time. Derik was furious. "Listen up, punk. I'm Derik Nolan," he growled into the receiver. "You're screwing with the wrong motherfucker. You call one more of our patients, I'm going to put a hurting on you." The following morning, Derik and Chris made some inquiries regarding Jacksonville Pain. They quickly discovered that Pete with Fay Imaging, their go-to guy for MRIs, was acting as a frontman for Zachary Rose, an American Pain patient, and he had incorporated Jacksonville Pain. Between the two of them, they were systematically calling all American Pain's out-of-state clients and diverting them to Jacksonville Pain. "It opens December 13th, Chris told Derik. They weren't sure what type of volume the Jacksonville clinic could handle, but once the zombies showed up with their cash, keep in mind 80% of all American Pain's patients were from out of state, Chris and Derik knew Jacksonville Pain would make arrangements to accommodate them. "What do you want to do?" asked Derik. And this is where working within the gray area of the law turned into the darkness of night. "Burn that motherfucker to the slab. Consider it done." Derik grabbed a gas can and several flares, but before he got a chance to torch the competition, Chris pulled the plug. Instead, he'd come across information verifying Rose was doctor shopping, so Chris decided they were going to drive up to Jacksonville on the clinic's opening day, check out the operation, and have a sit-down with the owners, Pete and Rose. He planned on giving them an ultimatum: close up shop or hand over half your business. It was only fair. The majority of their business was based on the theft of American Pain's patients. Unfortunately, Derik's 18-year-old brother, Kevin, who was on Christmas break visiting, and Derik, thinking there wouldn't be any trouble, made the mistake of letting him tag along. By the time Chris and Hudson, one of Chris's scumbag buddies, showed up at the parking lot of Jacksonville Pain, Derik and Kevin had already determined that Fay Imaging was providing fake MRIs in order for the Jacksonville clinic's doctors to pump out oxycodone scripts. Jacksonville Pain was a pill mill with the capability of rapid expansion. Even more infuriating, Derik had recognized half a dozen of their patients. Derik could see Chris was pissed when he entered the clinic to talk to Rose. Derik stepped into the clinic just as the meeting deteriorated into a serious confrontation. Suddenly, both Rose and some wannabe thug staffer pulled out large-caliber semi-autos, and everybody started screaming at one another. "You better be ready to use that," snapped Derik at the staffer, pointing the weapon, "because if you're not, I'm going to beat you to death with it." The confrontation spilled outside, and suddenly multiple Duval County Sheriff's cruisers whipped into the parking lot. The deputies immediately jumped on Derik, cuffed him, and stuffed him in the back of a patrol vehicle. Within minutes, Chris, Hudson, and Derik's kid brother were in handcuffs. The whole bunch was charged with extortion and thrown into the county jail. Chris' girlfriend, Diana, hired some big-shot attorney. A couple of days later, they were released on bonds between $60,000 and $250,000, provided they wear ankle monitors. Within weeks of returning to South Florida, a second clinic, Palm Beach Pain, moved in right down the street. The owner hired a guy to wave a sign at oncoming traffic directing American Pain's customers to Palm Beach Pain's clinic. No big deal, thought Derik. Next, they hired someone to leave flyers on their customers' vehicles. That was a little uncalled for, but not worthy of a reaction. Then Derik found a stack of Palm Beach Pain's business cards in American Pain's waiting room, and he decided to set them straight. Derik parked his Mercedes at the curb directly in front of Palm Beach Pain and stormed into their office. He threw the stack of cards in the owner's face and he spat. "You keep this shit up, motherfucker, you're going to need pain management." And he stomped out. Hours later, American Pain's security guard caught some guy passing out Palm Beach Pain flyers to patients as they exited the clinic. Derik mentioned it to Jeff and he growled, "This means war. We need to teach these pricks a lesson." "Dude," sighed Derik. He was still wearing his ankle monitors and had pending charges in Jacksonville. "You're going to get me arrested again. I'm not saying torch it. We'll just send them a message. We'll bring Zach." Derik looked at Jeff, and for the first time, he noticed the pattern. Every time he or his brother had a problem, they expected Derik to solve it for him. Still, just after midnight, Derik, Jeff, and Zach pulled up to Palm Beach Pain. Derik thought, "This is not a good idea," as he pulled out his slingshot and bag of ball bearings. He fired a dozen of the steel projectiles at the clinic, blowing out their sign and windows. Months later, the state of Florida dropped the charges against Chris, Hudson, Derik, and his little brother, Kevin. According to Chris, American Pain's new location, a nearly 30,000 square foot, 3-story building with 300 parking spaces, could handle the ballooning patient volume. However, according to Derik, within weeks of moving into the supersized clinic in January 2010, their staff of 24 meatheads, ex-strippers, and 5 full-time doctors were seeing a tsunami of over 500 patients a day out of a revolving client base of 30,000 patients. They were prescribing so much oxycodone, the clinic couldn't keep enough in stock to fill all the scripts. Derik and Chris were carrying out boxes full of cash and depositing it to multiple bank accounts, safety deposit boxes, and several safes Chris had installed in his mother's attic, and by the end of the month, they'd outgrown the building. In the 2 years Chris and Derik had run the clinics, they'd brought in over $40 million and distributed in excess of 21 million units of oxycodone. They were building out several thousand square feet of the clinic's office space to house multiple MRI machines and scouting locations in 9 different states for future American Pain clinics. In short, Derik told me they were planning world domination of the pain industry. On March 3, 2010, hundreds of deputized task force law enforcement officers simultaneously served search and seizure warrants on the American Pain Organization. At 6 a.m., they began banging on the doors of every employee and doctor's residence while raiding American Pain, Executive Pain, East Coast Pain, and Hallandale Pain. Derik had just stepped out of the shower when Chris called. "There are FBI agents everywhere," he yelled in a panic. "They're raiding my house." "What are you talking about?" "They're everywhere. It's over, dude. It's all over." The feds seized over $7 million from Chris, his vehicles and several shotguns, and a semi-automatic handgun. No one was arrested, but they stripped the pain clinics of every patient file, computer, and all medical equipment. They gutted the places like fish. However, not one task force agent showed up to Derik's house. No one even called. Not that there was anything to seize. According to Derik, although he'd made millions during his tenure with American Pain, he insists he'd blown most of it on booze, Benzes, and bimbos. Not long after the raids, Derik's girlfriend, Jennifer, called it quits. She packed herself and her little kid up and moved out. Derik says he only missed the kid. She was a real cutie. Over the next several months, most of the doctors agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for reduced sentences. Dr. Cadet and Dr. Castronuevo, however, refused. Chris, Jeff, and Derik, among others, vowed not to accept a plea, not to cooperate against one another. "No fucking way. I'm not ratting out my friends," Derik told himself over and over. Never. Chris and Derik went so far as to get tattoos of rats dangling from nooses and pledged death before dishonor. During a get-together at Jeff's house, in an effort to obtain further evidence of racketeering, the FBI wired Zach. He'd been a scout sniper in the Marines, and for $30,000 cash, he told Chris, Jeff, and Derik, "I'll pop a rock and Robbie. I guarantee he never testifies." They joked about knocking off everyone who was cooperating with the government. However, when Zach began to push them, Derik told him, "I ain't doing that, bro. Derik later found out that Robbie's father was a DEA agent and he'd managed to keep his son from being indicted for conspiring to sell oxycodone. He'd been delivering pills for Jeff for over a year. Then, on October 15, 2010, after trying unsuccessfully to obtain enough evidence to indict or convince Chris to cooperate, the federal prosecutor in charge, Assistant U.S. Attorney Paul Schwartz, had Chris arrested for being a felon in possession of a firearm based on the weapons they'd seized during the raid on his house. Still, Chris refused to accept a plea or cooperate, and their lawyers were insisting they could beat the case. Derik's breath was creating circles of fog on the visitation room plexiglass separating him and Chris. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Everyone was cooperating. Chris, Jeff, and Diana, among others. "That's the way it is," Chris said into the visitation phone's receiver, and he glanced away. He couldn't look into Derik's eyes as he told him, "If you don't take a plea, we're going to testify against you. All of us. You'll get a life sentence." Chris told Derik if he took a plea, he'd get 10 or 15 years, but if he cooperated, he'd end up with 5. Between December 2011 and February 2012, Chris was sentenced to 17 and a half years. Jeff got 15 and 8 months, and Diana received 30 months. The bulk of the doctors received between 2 years and 78 months, which was later reduced by half for their cooperation. Derik pled guilty to 1 count of racketeering, and he was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. Dr. Cynthia Cadet and Dr. Joseph Castronuevo were the only 2 conspirators to hold out. The government was furious. They immediately indicted the 2 doctors for distribution of narcotics outside the scope of legitimate medical purposes, which resulted in 7 deaths. They were facing life sentences. During the summer of 2013, Derik was called to testify at Drs. Cadet and Castronuevo's trial. He didn't want to be sitting in the witness box, but it was the only chance he had at getting his sentence reduced. Half seemed to be the standard. Initially, Derik's testimony seemed beneficial to the government. He laid out the clinic's roots for the jury as Cadet stared at him from the defense table. She looked sad, Derik recalls, and maybe a little disappointed. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Schwartz asked Derik if the staff at the clinic had seen the insanity in the waiting room, the zombies wreaking havoc, the junkie stunts, Derik admitted they had. Everyone had. When the prosecutor asked if everyone had seen Derik manhandle unruly patients and give his infamous speeches, Derik replied, "Yeah, man." He extended his thick tattooed arms as far as the cuffs would allow and said, "Look at me. I'm not a wolf in sheep's clothing. I'm a wolf in wolf's clothing. I don't hide nothing from nobody." Slowly, throughout the course of the second day, Cadet's sadness wore on him. She was facing a life sentence, and she'd been his friend. She didn't deserve that. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Schwartz asked Derik if he'd been promised anything in exchange for his testimony, a question he knew to answer in the negative, he replied, "Yeah." He then pointed to the prosecutor with his chin and added, "You told me if I testified, you'd cut my sentence." It was tantamount to witness tampering, and the prosecutor was furious. During his cross-examination, Derik admitted that the American pain clinics had looked legitimate. Hell, he thought they were legitimate. They had all the right licenses, paperwork, and diagnostics. It was possible that Cadet could have been fooled by the veneer. As Derik testified, the color slowly began to drain from the prosecutor's face. He could do nothing but scowl at Derik as his case against Cadet began to crumble with each of Derik's statements. "She's an awesome person," he told the jury. "She's my friend. I don't want to see anybody hurt." Derik was obviously conflicted about his testimony. "I feel horrible." The following day, Schwartz hammered away at Derik in an attempt to mitigate the damage. How did American Pain make money? "Selling pills," he replied. That had always been the plan. Derik admitted he was a drug dealer. Was Christopher George a drug dealer? The biggest. Did you ever sit down with any of the doctors, including Defendant Cadet, and say, "We're operating a pill mill"? Derik paused for a fraction of a second. He knew what the prosecutor wanted him to say. Instead, he glanced at Cadet and said, "No." The jury found Dr. Cynthia Cadet and Dr. Robert Castronuevo not guilty of distribution and the resulting deaths. Sitting in federal prison, Derik looks lost. It's early 2017, and he tells me, due to his unfavorable testimony and the acquittal of the doctors, the U.S. Attorney's Office refused to reduce his sentence. He's currently scheduled to be released in 2024. So I ask him why he didn't just say she knew the place was a pill mill. It's what the prosecutor wanted to hear. It would have changed everything for him. When you're sitting up there, replies Derik. He pauses and struggles for several seconds, searching for the right words, and says, you think you can do it. You think you can sacrifice that person for yourself, but you can't. I couldn't. We sat there in silence on the concrete benches outside the prison's housing units, in the center of hundreds of inmates, underneath dozens of seagulls. Even in January, the Florida sun is warm against our faces. So, I ask, did she know? Derik cocks his head to the side and gives me an ambiguous grin. That was our last interview. And yeah, I had Derik all wrong. You've been listening to Pain, the rise and fall of the largest pill mill in the nation. Written by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Keith Madison Miller. For more great stories by Matthew B. Cox, check out his website, InsideTrueCrime.com.